Avengers Twilight issue 1 opens with a much older and greyer Steve Rogers waking up, struggling to get up. As he sits on the corner of his bed, his wife Rosa comes by with some much needed coffee, telling Steve not to laze about all day since there's pigeons that need feeding. Steve is surprised to get coffee in bed, wondering what he deserved for such a treat, but Rosa will only say that she's grateful her living legend is still living, for now at least. Steve reminds her that he's just fine and he's just had some mild arrhythmia, but Rosa tells him to take it easy all the same, although she wants him to deal with the stuff in their living room so they aren't living in some old museum. Steve hopes that Rosa forgot what day it was, as it's August 13th, H-Day, and Steve is never going to forget that. Getting up, Steve heads through the house, seeing an old campaign poster from when he ran for Senate, an image which brings back hard memories. Later in the colourful hologram-filled New York, Steve quietly walks through the loud, bustling street, catching glimpses of advertisements of Iron Man, the new Captain America, Spider-Man, and Thor. He knows the world won't let him forget any of this, as a girl recognizes him as the original Captain America. Steve knows she wants a selfie or a picture, but the girl knows that she'd never do that. Steve quickly apologizes, knowing that his mind isn't what it used to be and he keeps forgetting the rules. A familiar voice asks if that's why he's late, and Steve turns to find his old friend Luke Cage waiting for him. Heading over towards the park, Luke reminds him that Matt is waiting for them there, and Steve apologizes since he had a slow start to the morning. Luke thinks that he kicked the caffeine, but Steve says that Rosa actually delivered it to him in bed today, since it's H-Day. The friends meet with Matt Murdock, who isn't doing too well since he's overrun with cases thanks to the Watcher Act turning every kid with an old cell phone camera into a so-called criminal. Matt laments about the terror curfews as well, which he finds redundant since Hydra isn't even a threat anymore. Steve thinks that Matt is doing good work though, since he reopened his legal clinic. Matt reminds him that they have to do something, and Steve, frustrated, reminds him that he did try to do something when he ran for office, and he was immediately rebuked by the voters that just told him that he's an old soldier wishing for the good old days. Luke playfully thinks that they should feel sorry for the man who has a beautiful wife and home, but Steve reminds him that he has no super soldier serum in his body anymore, and he volunteers at food banks and veteran centers, so what is Luke doing then? Luke doesn't want them to worry about him since he's an ex-mayor while Steve is a symbol and rights are being squashed, and Steve's voice could mean something against that. Steve knows they don't want to listen to him nowadays, but Matt thinks that they don't want to, but they need to. As the old friends talk, a spy drone keeps a close watch on them. Later on, Steve cooks up a storm in his kitchen, assuring Rosa he doesn't need her help. Rosa asks how coffee with Matt and Luke went, and Steve knows they are still fighting the good fight, as always, and they even try to guilt trip him into doing something similar. Rosa thinks that he's given his life to the country, and Steve knows that they are more interested in what Captain America can do, not Steve Rogers. Rosa doesn't want him slapping another big A on his head again, since he's done plenty of good without it. As the couple get ready for dinner, the TV begins to play an advertisement of a documentary about Red Skull and how he was supposedly a hero who worked against Hitler to take him and the Third Reich down from within. The advert also implies heavily that Captain America was one who tried to silence Red Skull, angering Steve, who punches the table hard, knowing that Schmidt only tried to take Hitler down so he could lead the Nazis himself. Rosa knows that they are just trying to whip up controversy, but Steve, frustrated, leaves for bed, lamenting how no one cares about the truth anymore. As he sits alone, he finds an old photo of the original Avengers team, making him think about Tony Stark. Elsewhere, the new Avengers bust up a Hydra bomb ring, and Iron Man tells the news that he wants to put it down to Thor's detective work that helped them out here, but it was just a simple call from the FBI, who picked up on some leads of their own. Captain America thinks that Iron Man is being modest as he managed to defuse a nuclear-level threat, amazed at the advancements with his armor, and they're all thanks to Stark technology. James Stark lounges around in his bed, thanking Captain America through the TV as Jarvis comes by, knowing that he could actually take the thanks if he agreed to actually be Iron Man. James only wants his coffee as Jarvis reminds him that he is not his butler, since that was his brother Edwin. James tells Kyle Jarvis that Edwin was more than just a butler, and Kyle doesn't care since he wouldn't have liked to clean up after James either. Kyle brings him a message he got from the president, since he needs James to come up with some new soldier armor since Latveria has increased hostilities against them. James knows he literally just did that for them and he doesn't have anything else to add to the new armor, but Kyle thinks he should head to the raft and come up with something quite quickly. James wonders if there's anything else, and the CEO of Stark Tech shows the young man a hologram of Steve Rogers, telling him the FBI want him to be taken down. Steve meanwhile is mic'd up and told that they are going live on air in 2 minutes. Steve thanks the crew for having him as James Stark comes out, hoping Uncle Steve is doing well. Steve calls him Jimmy, which James hasn't heard in a long while, figuring Steve always did live in the past. The interview gets underway and Tammy, the host, talks about the recent doco-series about Red Skull and how it shed light on his heroics. She welcomes Steve and James, revealing that he's the son of Tony Stark and Janet Van Dyne. James launches into a tirade about how old man Steve is just trying to shut out free speech, and he's become quite vocal about it as of late, slinking out of retirement because he thinks his legacy will be tarnished. Angered, Steve knows that that's not even remotely true, and Red Skull was a monster who killed a lot of good men and women, and it's their sloppy reporting that is a slap in the face of those dead heroes. James, who loves riling Steve up, wonders when do these people stop being considered heroes, knowing that he and Tony painted the world black and white, heroes and villains, but then the Avengers brought them Hero Day. Tammy brings up footage of that disastrous day, showing how Boston was completely leveled by the Avengers. James thinks that that's when the world woke up and realized that there was no line between vigilante heroes and media-dubbed villains, and most of the destruction was actually attributed to Dr. Bruce Banner, who was a founding member of the Avengers. Steve reminds him that it was mainly Ultron who did it by enhancing the villains and taking control of Banner. James fires back, reminding Steve that the evil AI known as Ultron was also created by another Avenger, Dr. Hank Pym. So if he lies about that, how can they take his word on Red Skull? Steve stands, telling James that he knows what a hero looks like and they look like his parents. Steve thinks that James is tarnishing his parents' legacies, also his doesn't look as hollow in comparison. Steve storms out of the studio, refusing to let James tear open old wounds for ratings. He immediately regrets getting hot-headed in front of him, but knows that James has so much of Tony and Janet in him. They always loved picking fights with him about his old-fashioned ways. He also knows that James is just a kid who's protected by Jarvis's younger brother and holed up in a castle in the sky, but when he was the boy's age, he was down in the trenches fighting and watching friends die. Steve gets flashes of H-Day and the fires around him as his heart begins beating irregularly, and he forces himself to try and calm down. However, the fires he sees burn brighter and hotter. He remembers back in the day how he flew the Quinjet into Boston with the Avengers aboard. Iron Man tells the team that all of their secret identities have been revealed and everyone is being lured to their loved ones and being ambushed by groups of enhanced villains. Cap asks who's doing these enhancements, but Tony doesn't know yet, wanting to actually capture one of these villains alive to study. The Quinjet lands and Steve disembarks, making his way through the rubble until he comes across a dying Spider-Man. Spider-Man's mask has been ripped off, and despite the piece of metal sticking out of his chest, he still manages to make a quip. Steve tells him to save his breath since help is on the way, but Spider-Man stops him and tells him that he saved his aunt, telling Cap her name is May Parker, and he needs to promise to keep her and his identity safe after he's gone. Steve assures the hero that he will be fine, and before Spider-Man can tell Steve that he is Peter Parker, he dies, making Cap lament how he is Spider-Man, the best of them. Steve is brought out of his PTSD-fueled stupor by some armored soldiers of New Shield, who demand he get back inside as the curfew is almost upon them. Steve agrees to move on, walking by some kids skateboarding. One of them is recording with an old camcorder, which the soldiers see and grab, smashing it to bits and telling the kids that it's illegal to record one another, and they are out past curfew. The kids think they still have 10 minutes, but the soldiers don't care, demanding they move on or be arrested. Steve reminds himself to think of Rosa and his heart, but he intervenes, thinking the kids learnt their lesson and they could be left to leave. The soldiers demand that he move on, but removing his glasses, Steve tells them to leave. The men come for him and Steve disarms one of them with ease, tossing him aside as the others begin to beat on him, hitting him onto the ground as the kids escape. Suddenly, smoke fills the air and the soldiers are beaten down by some cloaked beings, who knock them all out before they can call for backup. The beings come for Steve, throwing a bag over the dizzy old man's head and whisking him away. At the raft, James arrives, telling Maxwell that he only works when the muse strikes, hence why he didn't call ahead for clearance. Maxwell explains that he respects that James is the only one who can seemingly make contact, but the scans indicate that too much usage of the device he plans on using could lead to irreparable damage. James doesn't really care about that, or the fact that the public could find out, wondering if that is what Maxwell is trying to threaten him with, since it would be only him leaking things, and if he does, he can take a visit to James's psycho rehabilitation programs. James tells him to leave since he needs some family time as he enters a clean room where the disembodied head of Tony Stark floats comatose in a stasis tank. James comes forward and puts on an Iron Man helmet, connecting with his father's brain, which he plans on picking through to find more incredible designs. Steve meanwhile has the bag removed from his head to find Luke Cage is the one who took him. Steve wants to know what is going on, and the cloaked beings think that he's not going to be on board for what happens next. Luke knows that he will, since Steve knows that they are at war, and he was made for war. Steve wants to know what this is all about, learning that Matt Murdock has been killed. Luke tells him that it's getting bad out there as the government and S.H.I.E.L.D. are squashing political dissent and the new Avengers are even invading other countries. Steve didn't know about that, and Luke knows that he wouldn't thanks to the news and internet being controlled by a conglomerate that James Stark is also a part of. He says that they have been trying to get the word out through messages, but really there is only one person for that job. Steve tells him that he can't even protect skateboarding kids now that he doesn't have the super soldier serum, and Luke thinks that they can help with that. Steve discovers that a woman named Carrie has been helping Luke rebuild the super soldier program, even making some super soldier serum. She had hoped to use it on some of their own kind, but just as Steve suspected, they all died when they used the serum. Steve doesn't think that Luke is serious about this, but Luke says that he doesn't want him to be part of the Defenders and strike from the shadows, since he's Captain America, an Avenger. Luke reveals that ever since his bulletproof skin started turning hard and it prevented him from moving under his own power, he became a man of knowledge and began working with a woman named Amy, an ex-new S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who has been building intel for him. Amy gives Steve a file, telling him that it came from people on the inside and it shows photographic proof of the abuses against Americans. Steve is utterly shocked at the contents of the pictures, calling Rosa and apologizing that he's not doing this in person, but he assures her he is okay. Steve begins his weeks-long intensive trials to get ready to receive the serum again, telling Rosa that he won't be coming home for a while since there's something he needs to do and he's finally opening his eyes and the eyes of others, but it's not something he can do alone, so he's going to assemble the Avengers.